Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. My next guest is one of those men. Marc Evans and I met on a men's workshop that explored play, intimacy, vulnerability, and freeing oneself from the tight box that is traditional masculinity. He describes himself as a father, an entrepreneur, and a husband. He feels the impact of the turbulent landscape of masculinity at many levels of his life. Being a father of a teenage son, in his values around what is good business, and being a cisgender white male who seeks change but is part of a culture in conflict around this very topic. I felt a lot of resonance with Marc as a person from the moment I met him, and I'm grateful that he wants to play with me in the New Masculine conversation. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
As I was saying in the intro, you and I met at a men's workshop that was all about this conversation, all about sort of disrupting masculinity, choosing new ways of being. How did you get involved in this sort of exploration for yourself?
Well, I think first of all, I want to acknowledge and say thank you for expressing what you did about a connection. I definitely felt the same thing. In fact, I think you may be the only person that I've kept in touch with from that men's group through, I don't know, what's it been, 4 years? I think something like that.
Yeah, sounds about right.
So I do cherish that. So I'm very honored that you thought about me to include in the podcast. So thank you.
Mm.
How I got involved. I feel like I'm sure like most men, I've been on a perpetual journey of sort of self-discovering adventure. It's taken its weird and wild twists and turns, but I think I've always been trying to figure out how to be um, a better person and a better man, I guess, in a way. I've, like everybody, I've had struggles with things and trying to understand my place and how I relate to other people and how I kind of move through life and what I want from life. And that particular men's group offered an opportunity to really explore that in depth with a lot of other men who were doing the same thing. And I think that's why I sought it out in the first place. I was a little bit I wouldn't say lost at the time, but I was definitely searching for something, for some help in finding my own kind of um, lodestone, if you will, to help point me in some new directions. And that's how I came to it. And that's what kind of got me, I wouldn't say entirely pointed in the right direction. I had to, like all things, you make some wrong turns and some right turns, but it definitely was a good mile marker kind of on a path that I've been on, I feel like, for most of my life.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that your viewpoint is that most men are doing this work, and I guess it's just not been my experience that that's true. I think we had a collection of men that were doing that, and I find that I'm collecting men in my business, in my coaching business, that are wanting to do that work. And yet, I also think there's also something inherently in you that is driving you to be a better person and to be a better man that I don't know that is present in our culture as a whole.
I would not disagree with you. I should probably mischaracterize that a little bit. I wouldn't say, I don't know that every man is certainly trying to uh, sort of find their way through it. I do think most men face those questions. Some may choose to ignore them or look a different way, or not acknowledge them in some way, shape, or form. And then I think there's those who it's it nags at you and sort of begs for some attention. And I think you know no judgment, but some people pay attention to it, some people don't. I think I'm probably more hyper aware of that in myself.
Yeah, it's such a good way of describing it. It nags at you. That's been my experience too, is that desire for perpetual growth and that desire to find more truth in self and authenticity that has nagged at me my whole life. So I totally agree with you on that. So I would love to hear a little bit about maybe what are some of the things you learned about masculinity growing up, or some of the ways that you've held it in the past, and sort of maybe how have those views or ideals around masculinity changed over time?
That's interesting. um my view of masculinity, I think, as a child, I mean, obviously a lot of it was dictated kind of by the norms of the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. um Being kind of a child of the South. I grew up in Texas for the first part of my life, and that had a being Texan had a very kind of or a Texan male has a very sort of um, I think rugged kind of um, traditional kind of aspect to it. At the time, I wouldn't say that I knew any of that, but men did men things, which was you worked outside and you built stuff and you swallowed your emotions and you didn't share certain things with people. And that's but I don't want to give short shrift to my parents. Like my father, who I love dearly, was very challenged with his ability at times to communicate emotion. He um, it was not in his regimen, and I think it was not in his family's regimen to sort of share the inner turmoils that were going on with him, or kind of be overly emotional in terms of sharing with me his feelings about me. Um, I got the I love yous and those sorts of things, but it wasn't effusive. My dad showed love to me by doing stuff with me, by coaching me, by teaching me, by showing me how to do things that he thought I should know. But also, I think it was challenging for him at times to participate along with me when I was doing things that I like doing that just didn't fall in his wheelhouse, right? So, there's always those sorts of disconnects, I think, in relationships. But so, the standard, probably the most emotion I got in things was anger, right? And to me, being a man meant you were angry about things, or if things came up, you got angry about it, and that anger was how you solved the problem. And so, um, it took me a long time to sort of unlearn that there's lots of other responses to those kind of challenges. And I don't want to leave the impression that somehow my father was this angry man or that he was abusive or those sorts of things. But like he would get angry, I think, at his own shortcomings, and that expressed itself in anger, and cursing and things like that sometimes. And so that's kind of how I learned, was like, if stuff doesn't work right, you get angry about it, but then you also figure out how to fix it. And so, you know, I, that's, I think that's a sort of very narrow definition, I guess, in a way, of some of the things I grew up with around masculinity as a
Well,
kid.
it seems to me that what you were pointing out, that what you internalized, whether you were being told it directly or not, was is that men don't share their emotions and don't talk vulnerably about certain things, except for with anger. Anger's that one emotion that we're given permission to explore and to share. And I think when you are only given that small slice of emotion, it does become challenging. And it does become challenging to connect, because anger rarely is a connective force. um, Although I guess we're seeing in our current political climate, anger does seem to build a connection between people.
Yeah, Phil, it certainly can, no doubt. I think, I mean, I would agree. Anger and um, authority, those two things were, you know, probably I don't know, two of the takeaways that I think I got as a kid from what it meant to be a man. I totally agree with you. The anger part was, it's easy to share and it's powerful, right? It has this power to it to be angry. Um, but it's actually not powerful. It's a lot less powerful than it seems. I think on its surface, it feels very powerful. But when you really get down to what does it help you accomplish? What does it help you do in terms of your connections with people you love, or friends, or business people, or whatever? It is a hindrance in a lot of ways. It keeps you very constrained in what um, kind of where you can go. But authority was the other one. My dad was the authority on all matters. He was very, he not was he is still to this day. He's very, very smart, and uh, I kind of learned that as a man, you had to be an authority on things. Like, people respected you when you were an authority on things, and it took me a while and I still struggle with it to this day, but to learn that when you're an authority on things, you're not open sometimes to hearing another person's perspective, or information that you may not have, or information that you may need to help you build a relationship with somebody or solve a problem, or whatever the case may be. So, those were two of the things for sure. And the sharing of emotions, absolutely. Like, that wasn't a common sort of part of the dialogue between between my father and me, and certainly not between his father and him. And I'm sure that stretched back for a very long, very, very long way. We Evanses have been around for a very long time. We're like Smiths. We're just, you can't get rid of us. So I'm sure it's been in the family tree for quite some time.
And yet I would also offer that it's not just sort of a generational thing in your family, but it is a cultural wounding. It is a message that many of our fathers and their fathers and their fathers have been holding. And I think that's sort of what's led us to where we're at, and what's led us to sort of being in a culture that is having conversations around toxic masculinity and consent and diversity. Something that I heard you talking about was around that concept of authority was, it sounds to me like you actually value a much more cooperative style, or that you value um, being open to others' input or the experience of others, and that authority piece actually limits you sometimes from being able to access that.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen this really I mean, it's especially apparent in the business world and those sorts of things. It's funny. I'm competitive. I certainly like to compete in things, but I'm not cutthroat. And I think some of those things get tied together often in a way where, to be the authority and then to employ anger when conflict arises, they point to this sort of cutthroat competitiveness where I or someone has to win to feel good in a way. And I haven't really ever subscribed to that feeling. I never felt good if I did something that left someone in the dirt, so to speak. And so I do prefer a much more cooperative approach to life. It doesn't mean I employ it all the time. I have my failings at times where I just want to be right, or I just want to get something done. But what I find is that the result is usually less than if we have there's sort of a cooperative dialogue about how to problem solve, or how to approach a relationship, or how to raise a child, or how to do any of those things that we do in life. And I think it's the thing that prevails in a lot of ways at the moment, and this sort of moment in history especially, is the the unwillingness of people to really cooperate, which means having to be vulnerable, having to put forward ideas that might be rejected and be okay with that, or that might be rejected but pieces of them live on to survive in something that you're trying to work out together, um, and that keeps you engaged in the dialogue. And so I value that cooperation quite a bit. It doesn't always work in the business world. I run across a lot of people where that's not their end game. They put on the sort of the show of that being their end game up front, but as you start to get down into the nitty gritty, sometimes the cutthroatness comes through, and it tends to make things go squirrely. I don't respond particularly well to that. It's always a stressor for me when things get to that level. Um, and honestly, that was a source of some conflict between my father and I. It's like I wanted to cooperate on some things, and he just wanted to tell me how to do it. So I struggle with that as a dad, with my son, my daughter, in trying to guide them to places. I try very hard to engage them on a cooperative level, but I'm not 100% effective all the time at that.
How's that evolved in you? Have you taught yourself that? Have you found others that hold that well that you admire? What's that process been like for you?
I think I was very fortunate, um, in my sort of elementary through high school years, first of all, to have found a group of male friends. I mean, I had a large group of friends, but a group of male friends who I'm still to this day friends with. They don't live where I live, but we communicate daily. And they all tended to share that approach. There was not, it was a very sort of free form, for high school boys, especially relatively open, relatively honest, um, kind of group of guys who didn't engage in that behavior that I saw oftentimes with other boys in high school of, for me to feel good or for me to feel like I'm popular or winning. I don't know, however you want to define that. I have to step on other people. It was actually a very, in my experience from other people I've spoken to, it seemed a very rare convergence of conscientious boys who were caring of one another. We're still very caring of one another. And so I think that provided an initial balance for me, by pure luck, pure happenstance, I think, as kind of a bit of a counterbalance to my relationship with my father, which, you know, suffered at times from not having a sort of equity of those forces at play, I guess. And so I think that demonstrated that there was a path out there where I didn't have to be sort of cutthroat. I didn't have to be the expert in all things, that I could trust that people would hear me out, that people would be supportive if we had differences of viewpoint, or if we had conflict, that those conflicts got resolved in a way that was not going to be the end of a relationship or whatever it was. So I think that was a great starting point for me. I think I was still coming out of, because college was a different experience. I ran into more of that. I probably didn't build as many friendships in college as I did in high school, because it was harder for me to find that um, those traits or that willingness to kind of play at that level. So I think as I got into my 20s, I think there was a bit of a desire. Like I certainly had a desire in my 20s to find more of that. And it's one of the things that sort of set me on this path to, whether it was therapy or coaching or this men's group that we attended, or follow on things that I've done since then, was this search for that kind of meaningful relationship with other men. Um, and still to this day is the thing I probably seek in many ways more than anything else, are those kind of relationships. Like I have lots of relationships with men. I have some good friends. Some of them are more fulfilling than others. And it tends to be this, my fulfillment level in those friendships tend to be predicated on this sort of availability, openness, vulnerability, and cooperative nature of those people that I come across. And when I come across what's those kinds of men who, the stereotype would be, oh, it's an alpha male, and they're, I have some of those friends, but we have a lot less in common in some ways, and they tend to be much more good acquaintances than true friends, if you will.
Well, I love that you had that touchstone in high school growing up with those friends. And I think that how you were describing how you supported and cooperated and were with each other is sort of what I'm trying to recreate in this new masculine work is a group of men that support each other, that can be playful, that can call each other out on blind spots and can point out where there's some growing up to do, but from a place of connection and place of safety with each other. And so I love that you had that touchstone and that you in many ways have spent a lot of your life trying to recreate that experience, because I think you're right that that's not always the case, and I don't know that most men have a touchstone of that. It wasn't my experience that I had that. I'm just now in my life in my mid 30s starting to build some of those male friendships where that exists. I might have had one or two here and there, but your experience is sort of what I'm really trying to recreate with these conversations so that we can grow up together, so that we can find that. And what I heard you talking about is like the fulfillment in those relationships is really tied to things that are traditionally considered kind of feminine. Vulnerability, talking about your emotions, cooperation. And I don't mean they're associated with female, that they are female traits. I mean more of that energetic femininity that is more about cooperation and development and connection rather than goal oriented, driven, separate, that very masculine energy style. And I think there are benefits to both, but it sounds to me like you're finding fulfillment in relationship based on often more feminine qualities.
No doubt. I mean, for me, I think that is very true. I find it. I actually, in distinguishing between feminine and women, I guess, as energies and yeah, gender category, I guess.
Mhm.
Um, I find it much easier to talk to women, and not in a "I'm hitting on you" standpoint. That actually is more horribly awkward, but in a genuine conversation level, you know. So, um, I've always found it much easier to have female friends because I find that the conversations with them become more meaningful and interesting and less at a distance than most of my conversations with men off the kind of off the bat, like right off the bat. When meeting a group of new people, like I've never been that comfortable with like meeting a new group of guys and let's talk sports and let's talk this. And it's like I can do it and I can certainly hang in there for a bit, but I very quickly start to feel like it becomes this very, for me, at a distance kind of interaction. Now, for other guys, they live for that stuff. Their friendships are based on their love of those sorts of things, and some of that's an interest level, and some of it's an energy kind of level. And so, um, certainly, women for me have always been easier to talk to and to do business with, and that sort of thing. It feels much more resonant for what I look for in a relationship with somebody than with certain men, for sure.
Well, I think that's why you and I resonate with each other is because I very much have the same experience that women are just easier for me to connect with. And as you were pointing out with your own father, much of the intimacy that was there between the two of you was based in the activities you were doing, him coaching you, him guiding you in activities. And I think that often becomes the model for male intimacy, is the activities we do together, not who we are as people. And so men in our culture, in my experience, aren't really taught to dive in their friendships with who they are. They're actually much more inclined to just do things together and to play and to compete and to, sometimes in very divine ways and sometimes in really immature ways. But I do think that women are taught often something different. And then there are those of us men who are very much male, but also value the being and the sharing and the vulnerability and the depth that comes from sort of those feminine qualities that connect us.
I agree. Those are, by the way, also the most terrifying for me. Being it's it's this push and pull of wanting relationships that are based on those things, but also, oh God, I have to put this, I got to put myself out there on this basis to get something back. And I think there's something for me, the most challenging part of that is that was always so difficult with my father, not because I got negative reaction, it's because I got little to no reaction for those things. And sort of the absence of a reaction was in some ways much more painful than, if it had been a negative reaction. And so, um, and that's just, unfortunately, that's how he was built. Those things were very difficult for him to do. They're still very difficult for him to do, although he's gotten more available as he's gotten older in certain ways, less available in others. But yeah, that's always been my biggest challenge, and I think it's my biggest challenge with men. Like men, I do get intimidated at times by men who are very sort of alpha, and I would qualify that as one or two. Either they have that sort of more aggressive energy in a way, which is not a bad thing, but it's if that's sort of what I pick up from on them, or where I don't feel like there's an availability to sort of make that approach. And so I tend to be very cautious and very wary in my initial interactions with men, whereas I don't have that same expectation with women. I'm sure that's because of my upbringing. My mother was much more sometimes too available, but available in general, for me to have a dialogue about that kind of stuff. And so it was always a safer route. Like women are safer in that way, generally speaking, but not always. I think certainly women that I've had relationships with, even my wife now, there are vulnerabilities that are still hard to show even her. And we've been together 20 years, and there's certain elements that are vulnerabilities that I really have to um, work with in myself to be able to share those things with her, because there's still, I don't know, in there somewhere is that fear of not rejection. Like I don't fear rejection. I fear the non-reaction. Right, for me, that to me is way more sort of damaging to my own sort of inner psyche than a rejection. Like I can handle a rejection because that's more clear. So, but there's something about a relationship with men, and I probably should qualify that because it's more straight men, right? Gay men, easier. Like that's an easier. I had one of my good friends in that group in high school was gay. He didn't come out till college, but I love being around him. He was super easy to talk to and super fun. And when he came out, I was kind of like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay,
Yeah. Many of us as gay men have access to our feminine sides.
yeah, you know, and so it is a particular male energy, I guess I should distinguish, and is one that is institutionalized, and it's society. It has this very ingrained pattern, not just in society. I think there's probably some biology to it as much as there is some environment to it, but that's the harder one for me, for sure.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come up for me as I'm listening to you. Not to get too coachy on you, but I think it is an important part of the conversation as you were talking about that there's a fear around vulnerability that drives your the way that you show up with vulnerability or don't show up. And as you were talking about, it's much more challenging to not get a response than to get rejected. And it sounds to me, based on what you were sharing about with your father, is that at least the child brain that you had at the time, that the no response felt like being ignored or not existing. And so in many ways, that's still playing out for you and that still drives you in your relationship to vulnerability. And I point that out because I think all of us as men have a fear that's driving our avoidance of that sort of feminine side of things, that sort of cooperative or that vulnerable or that emotionally literate side. But there's a fear that's driving it. And I would encourage men to sort of find out what that fear is. For you, it's the not existing or being ignored. For others, it might be fear of rejection. For others, it might just be fear of looking weak or being chastised or being called all of the names that I've been called to sort of um, keep me in line as a gay man.
Of course, yeah, of course. I mean, humiliation, the idea that you can be humiliated for something that you are, that you could be told that you're you don't matter because of who you are. I think that, the not mattering part for me is, um, I think you're right. It is part of the child brain. It is. I thank you for that insight, because it's that is certainly something that I have been working on for a very long time. I think, in my 20s, I think that fear was so pervasive in a lot of ways. It kept me very shut down and very unable to move with joy in life. As I have tried to tackle those things, and tackle is probably the wrong word. Tackle sounds way too physical for what it actually is.
Well,
But
you were
that's,
raised as a man in this
I know,
culture, so
it's
it's
true.
okay.
It's true. As I've tried to unravel that, I guess, because it is a tangled knot for me in a lot. It's very complicated. It has, I mean, it's simple, but it's complicated, right? It has a lot of tendrils to it that wind their way through a lot of my behaviors, and I've done a lot of work to try to understand those, to be perceptive of those, and to try and find ways to acknowledge them but not let them, keep me from moving forward. I no doubt have more work to do there. It's kind of it's a bit of a daily exercise at times. Some of it too, it's all those things: being perceived as weak, being subject to humiliation for making myself vulnerable, and then not either not getting a response or the rejection piece of it. Certainly those things can all lead to those feelings. I think as I've gotten older, hopefully a little wiser, I care less about those things. Um, I would care more about them from people who I had deep relationships with, but I also would know that it's something I could speak to them about. Hey, I really put myself out there about this, and I felt like I got nothing from you on that. It really hurt my feelings. Like, I could say that to a group of people in my life. There's other people I couldn't say that to. I don't think they would get it, or um, or they might not respond, uh, or they may respond in a very limited fashion. So I think I've become more aware of my understandings of what limitations others around me might have too, to receiving that sort of vulnerability or openness or approach or whatever.
I mean, that's important in all relationships, is understanding where the other is, and your ability to read that actually is a way of you staying safe and a way of you navigating a complex world. And I really appreciate you bringing up the complexity of working through these things for you. I think that's a common thing that men run into, is that once they recognize that there are tendrils that go everywhere, and that these issues aren't as simple as notice the problem and find a solution, but that they are daily practices. I think some men shy away from that sort of self-exploration and that the work behind that, because it's not so clean cut and it's not so easy to just find a solution. And so I just appreciate you bringing that up and acknowledging that it is work and that it is a daily practice. And yet, the rewards you're finding as you keep showing up for that practice.
Absolutely. I mean, my life has gotten better day after day. Well, maybe not day after day, month after month, year after year. Some days are
Rarely a
better. Some
straight
days,
line.
some days are better than others. But it's certainly, like, I look at where I was in my 20s, versus where I am now, and in many ways, it's night and day. I was such a closed off person. I still to this day don't know how my wife agreed to marry me at times. She always jokes that she saw the diamond in the rough, but she really helped me do a lot of polishing of that. There's still a lot of work left to be done, but she was actually, she had a lot of sort of practice on her own, with looking at herself. She, with some therapy, with some coaching. She actually now is a trained coach and does that to a degree professionally. But I think I got very lucky. She was sort of another. She was sort of the second piece of the very fortunate part of my life, where I had this group in high school, and then when I met her, there was something different in how we related to one another, and there was something different in how she really wanted me to find ways to explore that, and was helpful, not in coaching me or doing anything like that, but like in encouraging me in a way that made it seem okay to do. And I think that's that stigma, I think in a way, it's much more of a, well, I don't know. So, therapy and any kind of self-improvement, all this kind of thing, it all carries a stigma to some degree, right? Um, I think I know that for a long period of time, therapy, especially with women, carried the stigma of hysteria and all these kinds of things, right? Well, I think for men, it often carries this stigma of weakness, and you can't figure it out yourself, and you're not smart enough to figure it out yourself, and it's fraught because it touches on deep emotional reservoirs of things in people that you kind of have to deal with. And instead of being seen in our society, especially as a strength, as something that, like, oh wow, that person is really trying to unravel these tendrils of resistance and emotional challenge to free themselves, it's instead perceived as like, oh, you got to go see the shrink because you can't do it yourself, or you can't, whatever it is. So I think it's changing. I think more and more men certainly are seeking it. I think the culture around it has certainly changed. I think all the different types of practices that have arisen give more outlets for finding ways for people, men, women, both, to explore it in a way that speaks to them, which is good. But it is like those things are challenging to do, and I think the sort of traditional masculine shuns that a bit instead of embracing it as, which is so weird because you look at ancient mythologies and things like that, and ancient cultures, and men were often off on these journeys of self-discovery and self-exploration, and it was considered, you're mythic and you're heroic if you do all these things. And yes, it was often wrapped in the shrouds of battle and all these kinds of things, but like there was an inner journey going on too that was equally as important to the outer journey, and somehow that's gotten lost. And maybe we're starting to refine that there is a glory in a way to exploring that inner adventure, that inner quest.
Yeah, I mean, I think our culture is very much sort of missing some of those rites of passage, moments in life that ask us to look inward. And yet, those mythic stories that we've all studied and heard, oftentimes for men, it is a solo journey out into the wilderness. It is a solo battle. It is the hero's journey. And in many ways, that's true that we are all walking an individual path. But there's also something very mythic or ideal about the concept of being able to do that all on your own and celebrate it all on your own. And I think that a reclaiming of the tribe, a reclaiming of the belonging to something that supports and nurtures you towards that, um, can be really supportive. I think in many indigenous cultures, there was sort of at puberty for boys, there was going off into the wilderness to face whatever and to become a man. But then there's the community that sends you out. But then there's the return back to the community to teach that is a part of the integration of all of that. It isn't a solo journey, actually. There are parts of our journey where we diverge and are out on our own and are the hero. But there's other times where we are part of the collective that I think is such an important thing. And I think that I want to, as you're talking about it, it makes me so inspired to want to invite more men into this conversation because, as I've seen in my coaching work, it is traditionally a lot of middle-aged women that seek self-help and are doing this kind of work. My joke is that at middle-aged women want that eat, pray, love experience. They want to go find themselves, and men want to buy things when they're at their middle-aged stage. And yet I'd love to invite other men into this deepening of the inner world because I think there's so much richness that comes out of it. At that workshop that you and I met at, it was funny to me. I don't know if this was your experience, but to watch the first day or so of the men playing out very traditional male things, not wanting to be vulnerable with each other, not wanting, only connecting on sort of like the activities we were doing, but not wanting to share and be, and sort of scoping each other out a little bit. And the second the first man cries, everybody else is crying around it. So it's like there's this like deep well of desire for that, and yet none of us really know how to do it.
It's that's so true. I think that first day, I think the comment was made. All the men have defined themselves by what they do, not who they are. And I think maybe it was when one of the men gave a little bit more about who they were that maybe the comment came up. I thought that was really interesting. That certainly resonated with me during that weekend. That sort of telling people who you are is it's not the more acceptable thing to do as a man. You know, about
It's
telling
less
people who
valued. We
yeah.
ask people all the time, the first thing we ask people is, "What do you do for work?" We wanna know their value, and I think that's part of being in a capitalist society is you sort of wanna know people's value based on what they produce and how productive they are, and yet what I hear you saying is there's so much value you've felt at an experiential level from sharing who you are.
Yeah, I really learned when I meet other men now, I try to wait a really long time before I ask that question. I usually get asked it first, but I won't ask it in return until much later in the conversation. I have a very conscious approach now to try to find out more things about the person before I find out what they do or where they live. Those are the two. What neighborhood are you in, and what do you do? Those are sort of the two questions. And I think you're right. I'm looking to ascribe a value to somebody differently than that, because ultimately that can be interesting and it can be an interesting topic of whatever, but it's not the thing that's going to get me to a place of starting a relationship with somebody that I think could be a meaningful relationship or not be a meaningful relationship. But I agree with you that there's something about the return to the tribe. It's very interesting. I went to my last living grandfather passed away a couple of months ago. We had a memorial for him in Missouri about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was my mom's whole side of the family that basically went. And it's this very tiny town, 250 people in Missouri, that this portion of my family had sprung from, that led to me. And it was multiple members of the same family, and that family married members of the few other families, and so there's this. The graveyard is like 10 families, and they're all basically relatives of mine in some way, shape, or form, virtually. And it was very interesting to me to note that there used to be a lot more community and sort of shared tribal, and I with a small t, not a big T, kind of environment, because I think tribal with a big T can be very dangerous at times. But the idea that there's a shared effort in helping people live their lives, and you know, for the last 100 years, especially, people move away from family. The concept of family now is so different than it was in 1880 or whatever, where you could usually your family was pretty close by. You might have somebody down the road a bit, but occasionally somebody would move further out. Obviously, where people were pushing further and further out into the country, but everybody is so scattered. Like I'm not near any of my family. I don't have any family nearby anymore, and my wife's family is a couple hours drive to the closest, but even they're far away, and so you lose a bit in society when you don't have deep family connections in a way. And I don't know that that can ever go back to the way it was. I certainly think people can have deeper connection in their families, but it's not going to be a proximal one, right? It's not proximity based. And so your circle of friends has to serve a much different function. And I think I was fortunate that I got that group of friends in high school, because I don't know a whole lot of people who have groups of friends like that. And it sort of set a stage for me of like, I want more of that in my life. I'm still searching for it at times. We changed cities. We moved 5 years ago. It was a big, big move. We moved away from a lot of those deep friendships. And while we maintain them at a distance, it's different. And so it's taken a long time to rebuild those kinds of friendships, especially because I'm pickier, you know? So that presents a challenge too, but it's also an interesting opportunity. It's not very often in your life that well, I should say in your early life that you get to pick your friends. Like you kind of fall into a lot of friendships as you're growing up. But sort of consciously choosing your friends is a much different, and for me, choosing male friends is a much different kind of experience.
Well, something along the family line that I really want to pull you out on that I think is interesting to talk about is how you're navigating all of this. Like you've been navigating it on an individual level for yourself your whole life as a man in this culture, but you're also raising a teenage son. And I really want to hear more from you about sort of what you see as some of the challenges and how you're navigating them, and what's been coming up for you around masculinity as it relates to teaching a boy how to be a man.
It is challenging. I can certainly say that. It's challenging and exciting. The first thing I did was I really have endeavored to be available to him, to both my kids, but to him because I never wanted him to feel like I didn't respond or I didn't care or I didn't hear him or see him or perceive what's going on with him. He would probably say sometimes I've gone across the line. He's like, "Dad, just leave me alone. I'm a 14-year-old teenage boy. I don't need you all up in my business all the time." And so, it's a narrow line to walk, but I've always tried to help him see that I'm open to anything he has to tell me. But I've also tried to share my experiences with him of events in my life that had those kind of impacts on me, and how meaningful they were, so that he can sort of see by anecdote, if you will. But I've also tried to encourage him when he's when he's having some of those experiences himself to not be afraid to be vulnerable in that situation, or to kind of grab it with gusto and say, you know, this is part of building a bigger world. I love this phrase, and I credit it all to my wife. But she at one point when our kids were little, and our kids were very shy when they were little, still shy, although less so to this day. But my son definitely is more introverted and can be more shy. And so she said, our job as parents is to make your world bigger. And the first time she said that, it just set off all kinds of bells in my head. Is like, yes, that's my job as a father, is to help our kids have a big world. And part of being a part of or creating a big world for themselves is doing. You can't create unless you're vulnerable. You can't create unless you're willing to share. You can't create unless you're willing to risk a little and reach out to people and try things and fail and make mistakes. And it's all those things are okay because you have the support under you, that if you run into obstacles, you're not going to be left out in the wilderness of that big world by yourself. And so that's what I've really internalized as kind of the underlying mantra of what my job is with my son and my daughter. With my son, it is challenging though. He's at that stage of life where I'm very careful about advice, right? Like I try not to just throw advice at him. Sometimes it's hard not to, but I try not to. I try to let him inquire, and then we have a conversation about it, whether as opposed to I'm going to tell you how to do this. And so, he'll ask me sometimes. He just started high school, so he's getting a lot more interested in girls and those kinds of things. And so, he started to ask those kinds of, Dad, why do girls do this or do that? And sometimes it's, well, it may not be all girls. This particular girl that you're talking about, I don't know. It could be this, it could be that. What do you think? Tell me about your experience. Like, what's, how does that feel? What are you trying to, how do you think you should respond? And so he's got this surprisingly way more than I did at 14, advanced emotional maturity about looking at those sorts of things. I don't know if that's us or if that's just him, but the things, some of the things he's sort of seeing and dealing with, stuff comes out of his mouth sometimes where I'm like, that never would have came out of my mouth as a 14-year-old boy ever. Maybe not even 18, probably not even 25. Like, I don't, where he came up with that. So that's exciting to see. But it is, the waters are trickier for him because there's all this societal discussion going on about, well, as he said to me one day, the news was on, and I I forget which political figure it was who was being accused of um, sexual assault or whatever.
One
He
of
just said,
many.
yes, he just said, God, Dad, is like every man an assaulter? And it really took me aback because number one, that's the message that was being put out in the media day after day after day. But it led to this conversation about what that means. Like really we had a very long conversation about, when they're saying assault, like what does that mean? What does that mean for your relationships with people? What does that mean for how you treat people? What is consent? And they had started touching on that in school, but what is consent in a relationship? Regardless of the relationship, but what does consent, especially in a sexual relationship, look like? Or or what does consent look like in something you would like to be a sexual relationship and the other person has no interest, right? How do you respect boundaries? How do you um and then beyond that, to there's just some people that don't have that level of respect. They think they're owed, or they think they are due, or they think it's their prerogative. And so I think it was but it's one of those moments that I never had that conversation with my father. I mean, we had the sex talk and we had a lot of those sorts of things. My parents were very much about treating people right. They were That's been a theme in both sides of my parents' family for a long time. Is treating people right is the paramount virtue. What they lost a little bit was also treating yourself right, and not subsuming treating others right to also treating yourself right. But that's what I've really been focused on: is how do you treat other people right? How do you treat yourself right? And those two things go hand in hand. If you're treating yourself right, you're probably going to be treating other people right because you're going to feel good about yourself, and that's going to carry over into these relationships.
Yeah, well, I love that you've taken the approach that your parents taught you and evolved it to how you parent, meaning you've always been taught and always had a sense of do right by others. And in the conversations that you're having with your son, what I hear you talking about is that you participate in the conversations with a lot of curiosity about what he thinks and not just telling him what to do and how to be a good person, but that you ask him questions about where he's at with it. And in many ways, that style of parenting is much like how I hold coaching is it's my job to ask questions and to provide a little bit of guidance, but also really to encourage the person to find their own way through it with those like sort of healthy guardrails on the conversation. And I think that being able to participate with curiosity creates two valid equal people in the relationship rather than having a parent and a child, an authority and a not authority. That both people matter so much and their opinions matter, and I find that people integrate their learning so much better when you allow that space.
I agree. And we were very fortunate to find a succession of schools that were more progressive schools that have that same philosophy, where the kids are engaged with their teachers in a way. And so it was super helpful as a parent to, in a way, have the support of that community of people who were fostering that same ideal kind of in how our kids approach the world. Not everybody has that, but what we found is when we moved to where we are now 5 years ago, we our son went to a year and a half of traditional public elementary school, and he hated it. He really did not like it. And when we moved him to the sort of more progressive school that his sister was going to, he just flourished. Like it just changed kind of how he viewed the interactions with his peers and with the teachers. The triple interesting thing about that is he's now actually at a private Christian school that is much more traditional, and he's flourishing there. But I think it's because in a lot of ways, I think he appreciates some of the structure now of that school, but and some of the opportunities because the school he was going to is very small. But he has this foundation now where he's able to filter some of the more kind of traditional elements of school through, and I think he knows that you can engage a teacher who is effectively the authority in the classroom, but there's ways to respectfully engage a teacher on ideas and on his own thoughts about things without worrying about upsetting the sort of authority apple cart, if you will. And I think that's the thing he balked at when he went to a traditional school. And that's just his personality. It's not an indictment of public schools or anything else, but it just gave him and his personality, kind of how he sees the world. It gave him a whole set of tools that he realized he had his own sort of internal validation about how he could relate to adults, especially, which I think was really useful. So we'll see how it goes. It's his freshman year. We'll see how things turn out for him, but so far it's been pretty good.
Well, something that I want to highlight that's more on sort of like a conceptual level that you're talking about is sort of the hierarchy of power that can be in our human dynamics and our relationships that is very much a part of that traditional masculine system. So you were taught to be a to do well by other people, to be good to other people throughout your life, but in some ways you were taught to put yourself as less than in order to do that. So that's, I think, what most of us are. We're either taught to put ourselves as more than or less than, not equal. And I think what you're teaching is how to see yourself as equal and how to show up as an equal in a conversation with respect, with kindness, but to show up as an equal. And when there's an equality there, it doesn't disrupt this thing of authority or this power dynamic that's inherently placed in traditional masculinity. It's about coming together and sharing ideas and cooperating and having real conversations, even if we disagree.
Absolutely. I think that's spot on. I think it's imperative that we find ways to help people be on, I mean, we're sort of more equal footing, you know, and that concept gets so corrupted in many ways. Oh well, if you put people on equal footing, then they have to have equal outcomes, and they have to have equal this, and they have to have equal. It's like I don't. That's a sort of severe bastardization of that concept, and putting people on an equal level in their relational dynamics means helping people be internally valid, self valid, right? And then that gives rise to validating others, like seeing the internal validation of somebody else, because you're not concerned at that stage that somehow they're better than you, or that they're going to take something from you, or they're trying to get things from you, or undermine your position, or whatever it is. It's you have the sort of self love in a way to realize that, like, you're good as you are, and it's okay for them to be as good as they are, and those things can live harmoniously. They don't have to live in conflict with one another. That sounds, as my son would say, that sounds very hippy dippy, dad, but it is to some degree.
I actually really love it. And I wish that that was at the foundation of what all of our conversations that are going on right now could be about is that I wish we could come to some agreement that it is really about this phase is really about creating enhanced internal validation and that there's each individual has a sense of value of self. And we haven't always been in a system that does that. And so we can disagree about how we get there and we can have conversations of how we get there. But if that was the foundation for the conversation or the center point of the conversation, that our job is to continue in creating internal value validation for people, I just think that it could be a whole lot easier.
I wholeheartedly agree.
And so, as we're learning how to create an internal sense of value for people, as we're bringing that into the center point of the conversation, are you finding any places where you're still unsure or you're finding challenges in raising a teenage boy during this time?
Daily. I think I mean, honestly, one of the big pieces that is a challenge as a father, and it's a challenge for me personally, it's a challenge for me in terms of raising my son, is a lot of the questions of privilege that come up. It's something we talk about quite a bit in some way, shape, or form, and it goes hand in hand with this idea of treating people right. But I think it also, I think the hard part is teasing out the various elements of what privilege is in terms of the things that you don't that one doesn't see. I shouldn't say you, but that one doesn't see. As a cisgendered white man, I balk at a little bit at the term cisgendered. I feel like it's in some ways it's become either pejorative or an obstacle to conversation because it puts me in a box, just like putting somebody else in a box. So I don't love that term, but it's one that's used. Um, but how, sort of this idea of that there are a lot of things work sort of systemically and endemically working against a lot of people in this country for whatever reason because they're different somehow than the people who've controlled the power in this country for a long time. It comes up in a lot of conversations with my son and daughter, um, more so with my son though because he I think there's more channels in a sense where that message is sort of communicated at him regularly. Um, and he struggles at times, I think, with uh, trying to understand what that means, understanding the history of it, understanding like why me, like why is this aimed at me, um, and and I say that not to it's hard because it's I think sometimes I can elicit the oh boohoo poor you cis white gendered male kind of reaction, but I want him to understand those things. I want him to view to at least try to put himself in you know whatever way he can into the shoes a little bit of people who are subjected to that, as limited as his ability is to do that because he's not of one of those groups of people. And so how do you educate yourself in a way to where you can understand to some degree, even to whatever limited degree it might be, the suffering that causes and the inequality and absence that the value of those people can bring to the world, can contribute to the world, right? That it's not only horrific for people who are subjected to those kinds of things, but it's a shortcoming. Like we're missing an opportunity to have all of those people at the table on an equal, again, as sort of on an equal footing, because great things can come from that, right? Why would you not want everybody contributing to making this world a better place? So that's a very big concept. It's hard for me to talk about. It's so big in some ways. It's hard to talk about, but it's very difficult to educate and engage with your child around. I mean, there's a lot of questions that come up. We talk a lot about how he feels about that, and then we talk about some of the how did things get to where they are. How did some of it's through schooling, some of it these things come up in many different ways. So that's that's really challenging. I think he's done a pretty good job so far of trying to understand it. I think I mean we did have though a while back where this is probably a year ago where I think he felt like he was getting so hammered over the head by issues of social justice that he started looking for sort of stark counterpoints to that perspective, and not out of some sense of anger, but because he was like, is that the only perspective? And so it actually led to a really great I was like, great, let's listen to some podcasts of some people who are on the other side of this. Let's read some things about this and let's talk about it. And you can tell me what you think. And so again, staying engaged with them, it's led to some really productive things. But man, it's challenging because honestly, in a way, I had this sort of sad freedom from thinking about those things as I was growing up, right? Like I wasn't faced or confronted with many of those things because of who I am. And so it's difficult for me because I'm like, I spend a lot of time getting a free ride on a lot of that stuff. Like I need to, there's things I really need to pay attention to here. There's things that I really need to factor into my thinking and approach and how I deal with people and in my business where, you just encounter all these people from all these different walks of life. And just because things seem fine and dandy in your sort of surface interactions doesn't necessarily mean that there's not all these variables that come into play. And then just I mean, the second piece of that is just normal teenagery obstinance and all the other things that you're trying to have these conversations. And there's days when it's just like, yeah, I don't want to talk about this right now, Dad. And you're like, but we need to talk about it. But okay, we'll talk about it another. It's like those kinds of things play into that as well. But um,
Well, I appreciate your answer and the length of it because it is a complex topic. And I think that what you're navigating is that it requires an artful hand when teaching this, when talking about this, because of the systemic issues, but because you're also navigating a child still while he is becoming a man. He is still his brain is not fully formed. He developmentally, he is in a place where it is actually much more about him and the individuation process and finding just him. And so teaching empathy, teaching putting yourself in someone else's shoes is a complex thing to do in this developmental stage just in itself, without all of the he is the representation as a cis white man, um, of the thing that's being talked about right now. And so it's like what I love and what comes to me at the sort of core and center of that is that you are doing everything you can to teach a sense of empathy to a boy becoming a man, because I think that's so missing in men most of the time. Is it's not really taught or valued in male culture, and so you starting at this point gives sets him up for more success in the long run. And something I'd offer is I totally get as a parent wanting to help bubble wrap our children from experiencing that tension or that confusion or that fear that, oh my gosh, why am I holding all of this? Why do I hear all this voice talking about me? And yet maybe that is what also increases a sense of empathy for others, because that is the system flipping the script, and it is the system saying, here's what it feels like to be a part of the conversation and about whether or not you are valuable or not. I think you and I are both cisgender white men. I belong to a marginalized community in that I'm gay. You're a heterosexual male. And so, in many ways, I have to constantly feather out where my privilege is, in the sense that I do look like privilege and in many ways enjoy privilege, but I also have the experience of feeling a part of a marginalized community. And so it is a confusing thing to sort of navigate at all times. And I think that you're in having these dialogues with your son, you're actually really setting him up for a lot of success. You can't control what happens and who he becomes, but you are giving him skill sets that I don't know that I've heard a lot of men out there doing, because they're so afraid to have the conversation because it's so complex.
and it's terrifying sometimes. I mean, I don't. By the way, there's times I'm like, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't. I hope I'm. I do the goal of empathy. That is a paramount goal. I feel like if you can have empathy for others, it helps you engage and have conversation with people from those sort of marginalized communities who have a very different experience of the world. And I think just being able to get some sense of how they're affected, and to have, again, the vulnerability to have a dialogue with people about that, not just to sort of treat it as, oh, it's a scary thing, we can't ever talk about it, but where you can actually listen to somebody's experience, not have your own defensiveness come up, and acknowledge that, oh, okay, I can absolutely see how that's part of what's going on. How do we change it? We have to, like, that has to change. um, and what can I do to change that? How can I be more aware? How can I be more supportive? How, those sorts of things, because I did feel very strongly, and that's the one thing that I will say about my son is he has a very strong sense of fair and just, and um, I do as well. I do not like to see people get mistreated for any reason. It's the thing that probably makes me more angry, and so, than anything else, and pushes me towards action of some kind or others. I don't like to see people treated really.
Considering our whole conversation today, and consider if you look back at your sort of unique perspective on all of this, is there one piece of advice that you could give to men?
I would say my piece of advice is to be curious about your sort of inner person, and don't shy away from embracing those parts of you that are chirping away at your vulnerability, your fear, um, your whether it's ignorance, your whatever it might be, is to see those parts of you as an opportunity to grow and fill some holes, if you will, in a way that your value becomes more intrinsic and it helps you feel like a more valued part of the world because it from there the world becomes a much easier place to navigate. And I don't say that necessarily because that's entirely my experience because I'm still trying to get to that place. But what I can say is the baby steps that I've taken here or there have certainly made my life more fulfilling and more enjoyable. And it is a bit like an addiction. Once you start to find those places where you're like, okay, I made this move here. I made this movement. I saw movement here. Or I saw progress here. This has gotten so much like things have gotten so much better. My ability to relate to people on this basis has gotten so much better. And those things eventually ebb, and then you have to find the next one. And so I think curiosity about yourself and your willingness to really explore a bit and stay vulnerable in those moments can be hugely valuable. And you don't have to do it all at once.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of the childhood way that we all explored the world and played in the world. It was more about the exploration and the adventure and the curiosity rather than having a set destination or just I know this. It was actually about let's go find out what's out there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Explore the inner you. It's worthwhile. It's good space to be in sometimes, and it doesn't have to be navel gazing. It can be very fulfilling.
Absolutely. So as I'm propping up your voice in this conversation around the new masculine, I'm also curious to know if there's anything in your life that you'd want to promote or to prop you up in another way to share more of what you're doing in the world or ways that people can connect with you if they were interested.
I don't know that I wouldn't say I necessarily have a plug for the business, but I'm a storyteller. I've always been a storyteller. My business has always been storytelling. I've been a filmmaker, and I'm now a film exhibitor, running movie theaters. I cherish the campfire. I love the campfire where people can come and tell stories, even stories I don't like or I don't agree with. I think it's important that people tell stories. I love hearing people's stories, and I like encouraging storytelling and the sharing of stories wherever that might be. So I think I would probably leave it at that. Like that's probably the thread in my life more than anything that I find the most fulfilling is creating space for that to happen because shared experiences make us all closer.
And if people wanted to participate in your version of holding space for storytelling, are there ways that they can connect with you?
Sure. I mean, I am on LinkedIn. I'm on all the various social media platforms. I run Alamo Drafthouse Cinemas. I'd love people to come and be a part of that, be a part of what we do. I think Alamo has a very unique way of inviting storytelling into the space of our country, and we're open to so many different kinds of storytelling ideas that I really do love being a part of that, being a part of that business. I don't know if that's a blatant plug or not, but
It's important because I think, as you were talking about, that you're a fan of the campfire. Like in many ways, the television screen or the movie screen has become the modern day campfire,
mhm.
and so you're holding that space and sharing storytelling in that way. So thank you for sharing that. There's so much complexity to this conversation, and there's so much that we all need support with as men. And I so appreciate you being a part of this conversation. And I want to invite other men to be a part of this conversation as well. And part of the work that I do in the world is to mentor other men and to coach other men around this development process and to be in the space with you as you develop. And so if people want to get in contact with me to either participate in this conversation or to receive coaching, they can go to my website at travisstock.com, or you can connect with me on Facebook. You can find me under Travis Stock, or on Instagram at Traver03. And I'm so grateful that you were here to participate in this conversation, Marc. And I'm super excited for people to hear your perspective on this. I think you've added a lot to the conversation.